Hello everybody, welcome back to another English 370 lecture video here. We've got a great one for you today. I'm excited. It's one of my favorite topics that we get to talk about during this class. We're going to be talking about historical linguistics. So this is a big change. We're switching modules rather suddenly from the semantics and pragmatics that we were just working on, and we're moving on from semantics and pragmatics to historical linguistics. Now, a bit before we get started about the next couple classes, the next couple weeks, and what that's going to look like. This is Wednesday's lecture, and here today, like I said, we're going to be talking about historical linguistics. On Friday's class, it's going to be our synchronous class for the week, so you'll meet with me on Teams, we'll chat, and I'll still be posting it here on YouTube. That's going to be in person, and it's going to all be review. And it's going to be a review on whatever you want it to be that isn't historical linguistics. Right? We're going to talk a lot about semantics and pragmatics. We're going to talk a good bit about things like syntax as well, because you have a test on Monday. A test coming up on Monday. So your test on Monday will cover everything from that we left off with on the first test to this second test. It will not include by and blank, the stuff that we're talking about today, historical linguistics. So it will go up to semantics and pragmatics. That being said, nonetheless, we're going to keep going with new material today just because doing these videos tends to be slightly slower than it is when I'm doing it in person. So we're trying to get through as much material as we can. So I didn't want to lose another day spending 2 days reviewing for your test. We'll do plenty of that on Friday, and if you don't get enough of that, well, you'll have to know ahead of time, I suppose. But I will also have office hours on Thursday from 10 to noon on Zoom, like I always do. So you can talk to me there about the test on Monday as well, as in Friday in class. All right, that's it. That's enough housekeeping. Let's get to the good stuff. We're going to talk about historical linguistics. I'm going to shrink myself down. Boom. And we're going to come at you with some data right off the bat. And what I want you to do is put your linguist eyes in, screw them in tight, and let's see what you notice about the data that I'm going to put up on this screen right now. What do you notice about these sets of words? So here right now, in each of these columns, I have a different language. This is Sanskrit, Greek. Oh, you can't see because my cursor's on the wrong one. Sanskrit, this one's Greek, Latin, and English. And all of these mean the same thing in each of their languages. You still can't see my cursor. Now you can. Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, English. All of these mean the same thing. So pad, pod, ped, and foot. Each of these means foot in its language. So pod is Greek for foot, ped is Latin for foot, etc. And this is a format that we're going to be using a good amount in historical linguistics. So think about, what am I noticing about these forms? Right? Think about what you're noticing. We're going to go over a bunch more forms. Here's the words for thin. I'm not going to pronounce all these for you, but these are all words for thin. Here we have words for 100, right? Hekaton, kentum. Here is words for slippery. Here another point of notation. These little dashes don't mean that Sanskrit and Greek don't have a word for slippery, right? It's just that we're not worried about it right now. They have a word for it. It's just not included in the data set. And that will become a little bit more obvious why it's not included in the data set later on. But it's not like it's blank. They have a word for it. It's okay. Here we have the words for 10, the number 10. The words for acre, agros, ager. The words for brother, brata, etc. Widow, and I think this is the last one. Yeah, goose. Here's the word for goose. So take a second, again, what do you notice about these here words? Something, I hope. I hope you notice something. What you've probably noticed, again, feel free to pause it here because I'm gonna barrel forward. What you probably noticed is like, hey, these words, they look, the rows that is, they look kind of similar, right? Let's look at this first one. Pad and pod and ped and foot, right? Well, these ones, like, they all have a P to begin with, these three, excluding English, and they all end with a D. The only change in this first one, again, excluding English, is these vowels. Right, again, here's a T and a T and a T with an N and an N and an N. Even English this time, a T and an N, although this is part of th, right? In IPA, we would spell this differently. Still, we notice these things. A D, a D, a D, a T, an A, an A, right? B's, P's, F's, B's. There's similarities here. There's a lot of similarities in the rows, despite these each being different languages. Sweet, we're onto something. Alas, it turns out we're not the first people to have noticed this little pattern that we're following here. If only we were 200, this is probably old now, it's probably even more. It's probably more like 234 years too late. A little late on. People beat us to this epic discovery, but only just. And we see this in a cool quote, a famous quote, if you're into historical linguistics anyway, by a guy named William Jones. He's a British dude, and he was in Calcutta talking to people about nerdy things and languages, and he had this to say, and this is kind of documented as the first documented place, at least, where people have noticed these patterns that you and I just noticed right now. And what he said was this: the Sanskrit language, so that's, again, sorry, I'm flipping back and forth, that's this language on the left, spoken in India. He's speaking in Calcutta, right? The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. Okay, we don't care as much about that part. What is this first part? It's just like some idle praise, right? It's pretty prescriptivist as well, like this comparison between languages that used to be cool back in the day that we don't do so much anymore. Anyway, that's not the important part. But he's talking about Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, and he's saying Sanskrit, yet bearing to both of them, where both is Latin and Greek, bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. What he's saying here, shrink myself a little bit, what he's saying here is that this pattern that we just found in these language forms, these similarities between languages, is too much to be a coincidence, right? This can't have been an accident. It can't just be happenstance. There has to be a reason. There has to be an explanation for all these similarities that we found. And the explanation that he relied on is historical linguistics, and that we are also going to rely on, is we're going to say, he's right, this isn't an accident. Instead, all of these languages, Sanskrit and Greek and Latin and English as well, are part of the same language family. They're part of the same language family, and that's why they look so similar. It's not accidental. It's because they're part of the same language family. Here's the rest. This is the second half of that exact same quote from William Jones that has to do with this. He says this: so strong indeed, again talking about the similarities between these languages, that no philologer is somebody who studied language texts, particularly back then, kind of a oldie linguist, no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. So he's saying these three languages, Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, nobody could look at these and think that they aren't related. To have sprung from some common source is his way of saying they're in the same language family. And he goes on, right, and says there's similar reason, actually, for supposing that both Gothic and Celtic had the same origin with Sanskrit, and that Old Persian, maybe Old Persian too, that all of these things can be put into the same language family. And what he's talking about, and what we've just discovered, is called the Indo-European language family. It's a very particular and very famous family of languages. It contains modern languages today like English and French, Greek, Armenian, Urdu, Polish, Russian, all kinds of stuff. And what we want to say about them, what makes them part of the same family, is that they all descended from a single ancestor. Right? They all have descended from the same parent. They're child languages. We can think of these modern languages as the children. And they all share the same ancestor. And this ancestor, in this case, we're going to call Proto-Indo-European. And not just us, everybody's going to call it that. Proto-Indo-European. So Proto-Indo-European is the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother language. And all these modern languages like English, French, Greek, Armenian, Urdu, and Polish are the children languages. Now, how quick we need to think about, we need to work through this kind of family tree metaphor for a second and think, how does that actually explain these similarities that we saw like this, right? We said this isn't an accident and that we need an explanation for it. How does saying they're in the same family even help? Well, again, we want to be a little bit careful about leaning into this metaphor, but it does help, right? Essentially what we noticed when we said that, like, well, the word for foot has a lot of P's and a lot of D's, is that we said something like, well, look at all these children with green eyes. Look at all these children with green eyes and dark hair and prominent brow ridges and a strong jaw. Right? We noticed the features of the language, and we said they look too similar. Too many green eyes here for this to be an accident. I bet that they share a parent. And that the traits of the parent who also had green eyes and prominent brow ridges, have gotten passed down to the children. In terms of the language, in getting away from genetics into historical linguistics, we'd say something like, I suspect that the proto-language, the parent ancestor language, also had a P and a D in that word for foot. And thus, all the children languages inherited that. So it's not accidental that they're sharing. It's just like, it's not accident that you probably, if you have siblings, you look like your siblings. That's not an accident, right? That's because it comes from a common source, as Sir William Jones would tell us here. They've sprung from a common source. That's how that works, right? That's how these family relationships work to give us similarity, right? There's a Game of Thrones joke to be made in here if you're a Game of Thrones fan. Okay, so we have this ancestral language, Proto-Indo-European, that a ton of these modern languages came from. And we posit that this language was a real language. It's not some hypothetical construct. We believe this to be a language, and one that was spoken by humans about 6,000 years ago. Give or take 1,000 years, which is quite a while actually, but roughly 6,000 years ago, people were speaking this Proto-Indo-European language. What's cool about this relationship between the ancestral language and its children is that we can actually, we have no documentation of Proto-Indo-European, of this ancestral language, right, of this proto-language. We have no documentation, yet we can actually say something about what it must have looked like or sounded like. How do we do that? Well, we work backwards. We look at the common traits that the children share, the ones that can't be accident, and we say the ancestor had those, right? It's like if I see you and your siblings lined up, I can say something about probably how your parents look, even having never met your parents. That's really cool. So we can take a look at these modern languages, English, French, Greek, Armenian, and we can work backwards, see what they share, see what similarities they share, and say something about Proto-Indo-European. That's kind of going to be what we're after in historical linguistics over the next few sessions. I was going to do it in 2 sessions, but I'm being slow. I like this stuff. It's probably going to end up being 3 sessions. This is a really cool and artistic depiction of a family tree in like a berry tree. It's a tree. Here is Indo-European, and we see different branches branching out till we get to these different leafy bits, which are different modern languages. Here's German and English, Afrikaans and Dutch. Over here we have Spanish, Hindi, Bengali, Punjabi. A bunch of different languages that have all sprung from this common source. Thanks, William Jones. Cool. But we have some questions we need to answer before we get more at the heart of this kind of reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European. One question we need to ask ourselves is that if we want to say that Proto-Indo-European was a real language and that real people used to speak it a long time ago, 6,000 years ago, and we do want to say that, you'll have to believe me for now, I'll prove it later. If we want to say that, we have to ask ourselves the question, what happened? Why aren't people still speaking Proto-Indo-European? What happened? Well, what happened was language change. And this is a fundamental principle of linguistics itself, not even just historical linguistics, but all of linguistics. And this is the idea that all languages change over time. Languages change all the time. In small ways, sometimes in big ways, languages change over time. Let's take a look at that language change, right? Let's take a look at that language change. Okay. Here is some linguistic data for you. I'm giving you a lot of data today. Okay, so go ahead and read this to yourself, right? Take notes. Make perfect sense of it. Give me a transcription. You guys speak this language. Okay, not really. You don't actually speak this language, but you speak the child language of this. This is the ancestor of English. This is what English used to look like. That's another way you can think about this. This is what English used to look like. So is there any bits that we can latch on to that we can say, maybe I recognize that? Not really for me. Maybe. I'll give you one more sheet of this. This is the same language. This is the second half of that passage that I gave you before. Anything you recognize, English speakers? That's tough. It's really tough. There are some things, there's some hints which will become clear later on. Okay, so let's fast forward just a smooth 4,000 years, no big deal, right? And we'll see how it's changed over 4,000 years. So now that first line, the original, the OG is on top, and now this second line is 4,000 years later. 4,000 years later. This is saying the same thing, except 4,000 years later. Now read the second lines here and see if you can understand anything. Castrana hunda fiando quamon ocusa berandia. Makes perfect sense. Yeah. Any hints? It looks a little bit better, right? Looks a little less crazy, at least. So maybe we're getting somewhere. Any guesses on things like hunda or kuniga? Think about some of these things. Let's take a look over here. Looking through, nothing's looking particularly familiar. Okay, I'll give you a break. Let's go further forward. Yeah, let's go another 1,000 years. Let's get a third line, and we'll see how it changes. Now we've got a third line, 1,000 years later, so 5,000 years after this first line. Anything here? Let's look through. It still looks pretty weird. Pretty weird. Ah, gold. Got gold. So far, so good. And corn, not just gold, corn too, right? So maybe it's coming a little bit more into picture here. Let's do one more 1,000-year chunk here to get to English. Now we're at English. Now we can see what it looks like, right? So here we have our final passage. It goes like this. Yesterday, 100 enemies came, axes carrying, on foot going, and in chariots riding. The king and of his men 10 they killed. Boom. The houses they burned, took much gold and corn. Told you we had gold and corn in there. Cows, pharaohs, and much else four-footed property. So this is really cool because we get to see change over time, right? We want to remember that sort of ultimatum that I gave you, that all languages change over time. And here we have English through the ages, right? And now that we can look back, hindsight's 2020 here, maybe there's some things that we could look, right? Like here's hus for houses, burn on for burned, goes to burnum, right? It gets a little weird over here, but burnum, burn on, burned. Not so bad, right? Not so bad. This is kurna, corn. My favorite one here, do you guys know what pharaohs are? Any ideas? Any listeners know what a pharaoh? I don't even know how you say that. Pharaoh, something like that? You know what that is? Well, I'll give you a hint. Like, look at it in context. These are the things they're taking. Gold, corn, cows, pharaohs, and much else four-footed property. Maybe some four-footed property. Let's look back and see if we can divine from our ages what this four-footed property might be. Yeah, so porkum, right? So pharaoh is a baby pig. It's a young pig, a pigling. Right? And we can actually, like kind of see that. Like it's a pork, it's a little pork. But it's not just a big pork, it's a porkum. It's a little baby pork. So there's a bunch of this kind of stuff you can see, right? Hund for 100. This little axe guy looks reasonably similar there. If you know any Latin, things like regum going to king aren't too surprising, etc. Anyway, change over time. And what I've given you here is that first line of this passage is Indo-European. The second line is Germanic. That's 4,000 years later, or about 2,000 years ago, right around 0 BC. Old English is 1,000 years after that. That puts it at about 1,000 AD, and modern English today. Right? Those are your 4 lines here. It's cool. It's cool. If you want a little clip of how this actually sounded, and I attempted to pronounce some of it very terribly, but if you want somebody who actually knows what they're doing, go ahead and visit this YouTube link. And they'll read you like a fable in Proto-Indo-European, which is kind of cool. So languages change, but languages don't just change over periods of 1,000 years or 4,000 years. They change much. They're changing every day, essentially, in very small ways. Change is still happening today. This isn't a finished product. We didn't just get to modern English and say this is pretty good. I think we'll hang out here. It's still changing. Language change is still happening, right? And we don't really notice these things. And we don't notice these things because we're not paying attention, right? We don't do things like tape record our neighbor every year during Easter and analyze the linguistic content in his year-by-year change. It'd be a really cool study if you did that, and you might actually find some differences of how you or a neighbor sounds today versus how you sound in 30 years. Somebody actually did that, right? And this is talking about an individual's speech pattern changing. They did a really cool test. This is a study by Harrington et al., where they looked at the Queen of England, and they looked at her Christmas broadcasts, so not Easter, that's the closest holiday to when I'm recording this, but they looked at her Christmas broadcasts from the 1950s and those from the 1980s. So they looked at a 30-year gap. What did the Queen sound like in the 1950s? What did the Queen sound like in the 1980s? Because, of course, we have recordings of these speeches, these broadcasts. And what they found is that over time, the Queen is shifting her language use to become more like standard Southern British. She's becoming more standard, actually. The question here, of course, the catchy title is, does the Queen even speak the Queen's English anymore? Depends on how you define it, of course. She's always the Queen, but it's changing. And so here's some graphs that show this. What's going on here is that the S's in these graphs are standard Southern British pronunciation. Again, think of our phonology here. And the 5 is the Queen's broadcast from the 50s, and the 8 is the Queen's broadcast from the 80s. And what you notice pretty consistently across these 10 boxes is that the 8, the Queen's broadcast from the 80s, is closer to the S than the 5 is, right? So the 8 typically appears between the 5 and the S. The Queen has shifted towards standard. The Queen has shifted towards standard. The Queen has shifted towards standard. Shifted towards standard. Is there any exceptions here? 5. This one's a little less clear, but generally the 5 is further away from the S than the 8 is. So change still happens over time. It's just a fact of language. It's just something that happens. And this in itself, this fact that language changes 4,000 years ago, and language is changing today, and language will be changing 4,000 years from now if we're around to speak it, is called the uniformitarian principle. Labov, a famous sociolinguist who did some historical linguistics as well, actually quite a lot, puts it like this. The claim that the same mechanisms which operated to produce the large-scale changes of the past may be observed in the current changes taking place around us. Right. I'll give you a second to let that sink in. What he's saying is the changes that brought this top line to this bottom line that have happened in the historic past are still happening today. The changes that operated to produce these really big changes, right? We couldn't even read it. These can be observed in the current changes right now. The same thing is happening. The same thing. It's cool. This is an important principle for a variety of reasons. One of them is that it fundamentally tells us something about language and language use and language change over time. It tells us something fundamental about language. So it's really important for that. But it's also really important for historical linguistics because it gives us an even playing field, right? We weren't around 6,000 years ago when Proto-Indo-European was spoken. So we don't know what was going on, but this uniformitarian principle allows us to posit, to assume, to hypothesize that the changes that were happening in the Proto-Indo-European language 6,000 years ago are the same changes that are happening now. And that gives us some leverage. It gives us some a place of confidence to talk about what was going on 6,000 years ago that we wouldn't have otherwise. Because we don't really have the data. Right? But if we believe these changes to be consistent in some ways, we can say something about what was happening back then, which is really cool. Cool. Along with this uniformitarian principle comes some other sort of corollaries, I guess, which is that these earlier stages of language, so Old English, but also Germanic and also Proto-Indo-European, these are just languages. They're languages just like English is a language. They're not quantitatively different from English. Proto-Indo-European is just a language like any other language. It's a natural human language. It's not like ye olde language and they didn't even have pronouns back then. Ha! No, it's a fully fledged language, right? It's just another language. It's not any different, any worse, or any better. I'll get to that in a second. I'm going to reiterate that point. But it was just another language. It's only proto. Why do we put that proto in front of it? For Proto-Indo-European? Well, we put that proto in front of it because we don't actually have documentation for it. That's the difference. So Germanic, for instance, we have written records of things around that time. But we don't have written records for like Proto-Germanic even further back than that, or for Proto-Indo-European much less so. Nothing has survived if people were writing back then, right? Probably they weren't anyway, but. So that's what the proto is. It's not to delineate as a lesser language or different in any fundamental way, other than we just don't have access to the written documents. That's why it's a proto language. Cool. Anyway, that's what I was saying. We already talked about this. And along with this, I hinted at this already, is that this change that goes on in languages, again, that we've been seeing from 4,000 years ago to 2 to 1 to now, it's not decay. It's not degeneration. Like, language isn't getting progressively worse as it changes. Change in language, linguistic change, is not decay or degeneration. This is important. This is important, right? Despite what your grandparents might tell you about kids these days and their use of emojis and their, all these videos on TikTok, whatever, it's not decay. Change is not decay. We can talk about this on a general level during a discussion if you like, but from a linguistic standpoint, I can stand fast and say that absolutely, change is not decay. Things aren't getting worse, they're just changing. And this is processes that have been happening for thousands of years, which is what we've just seen. The flip side of this is that change is also not progress with regards to linguistics, right? With regards to linguistics. Not saying we don't progress, but linguistically, these changes that are happening don't make our language better or worse. It's just different. It's just change. This is Jespersen, who said, this was not always recognized to be the case. In the evolution of languages, the discarding of old flexions goes hand in hand with the development of simpler and more regular expedients that are rather less liable than the old ones to produce misunderstanding, right? What Jespersen's getting at here is that language is getting better. We're evolving to be superior. No, we're not. It's not how that works. It's just different. It's just different. In the same way that all modern natural languages are created equally and equally well suited to express life to each other, we say the same thing about old languages because they're also just natural languages. Because they're also natural languages. We don't have to say whether they're better or worse, and in fact, we won't. They're just languages. So, language is constantly changing, and they're changing in kind of unpredictable ways. So if these changes are essentially arbitrary, and we only have today's languages and back a couple thousand years, how can we say anything about language relatedness or proto-languages? How do we know anything about them? Well, changes aren't actually random. Linguistic changes, lucky for us, lucky for historical linguistics, historical changes aren't actually random. Rather, they're patterned. They follow patterns and they're regular. Right? Here, we'll go over a couple more things, talk about a couple more historical things, and then we'll cut it. First, I got to introduce you to my boy Rasmus Rask, 1700s to early 1800s. And this guy was cool. He was a great linguist. We would call him a linguist today. Back then, they called him a philologist. Right? And he spoke a ton of languages, and he was particularly focused and interested in looking at Proto-Indo-European languages. like the ones that we're speaking and the ones that we've been looking at largely up to this point. And he did a ton of documentation on how languages were similar, these Indo-European languages, except he didn't have any access to Sanskrit. Not his fault, he literally just didn't have access. So he was working with only a few pieces of the puzzle. He didn't have the full puzzle. And he said this. He's going to set up kind of our methodology of historical linguistics, which is really cool. He says, when agreement is found in the most essential words in two languages, and so frequently, so the similarities are so frequent that rules may be drawn up for the shifts in letters. Okay, we don't care about letters. He was a philologist, we're linguists. We care about sounds, but whatever. That you can draw rules to show you the shift from one sound to the other sound. Then there's a fundamental relationship between two languages. So he's telling us about when we can say languages are related, especially when the similarities in the inflectional system and in general, the makeup of the languages correspond. Don't worry about this last part of the quote. I just felt bad not reading it. So we'll take an example and we'll look at Rasmus Rask's take on it. Here we already saw some things like this. Again, we're being Rasmus Rask for the moment. It's a cool name, right? So we don't have access to Sanskrit, that other column that we were looking at. But he saw things like this. Pater, pater, father, tres, tres, three, hekaton, kentum, 100. And he found these patterns. P, P, F. T, T, th. K, K, h. This is a K, right? Patterns. Patterns. And he didn't just find these things in a few words, like father. He found these things again and again and again. So not just p, f, and pater, pater, father, but also in pod, ped, foot. P, f. Right? He found these over and over and over again. And he said, look, when you get these recurring things, what you can do is you can write rules. You can write rules that get you from these sounds in Greek and Latin to these sounds in English. So what we can do is we can write a rule. I got my marker, I got a handy whiteboard here. So we can write a rule that says, give me a second. So keep this data in mind. I'm going to take it off the screen for a second to make myself big, but keep in mind this sort of PPF pattern with pater, pater, father. So we can start to write rules that look like this. So we can say something like a P in Greek and Latin corresponds to an F in English. F in English. Right, and then we can look throughout these languages, we can look at Greek and Latin and English to see if this pattern in fact holds. Right, and again, we find ample evidence of this, right? We find pod, ped, foot. No, glare's bad. Where we have P, P, pod, ped, foot, and we find pater, pater, father. Right? We have all these things. So we find these recurring patterns in the relationship between these languages. And what Rasmus Rask is saying is when you find a lot of those and they're really consistent, just like William Jones said, that's not an accident that these things are then related. These things are then related. We're going to check just a clarification here when you write this kind of stuff here. It's better off not to think of this as an arrow, because Greek and Latin didn't become English, right? These are both modern languages. Okay, Latin a little bit less, but whatever. They're relatively modern languages. English didn't descend from Greek and Latin. They're just related. So instead of that arrow, we're actually going to put a colon in there. Like this. To show that P in these languages corresponds to F in this language. This is a correspondence. And we're actually going to call this. We're going to call this a correspondence set. That this similarity between the languages that we noted and we kind of put in this semi-formal way is a correspondence set. Letters or sounds that correspond to one another across two or more different languages. All right, away with me. And we'll look at this from a slightly different standpoint, and then we'll call it for the day. I think I'm done with whiteboard. So I'll introduce you to another person. You actually probably already know about this guy. He's pretty famous. This is Jakob Grimm. Lived about that same time period, right? Rasmus Rask was late 1700s to 1800s. Actually didn't live all that long. Jakob Grimm, on the other hand, did live for quite a while, but born around the same time. He's also a linguist. Did a lot of linguists when he wasn't writing fairy tales. This is not actually a joke. This is actually Jakob Grimm of the Grimm's fairy tales, Grimm Brothers fairy tales, right? That same guy, also a linguist. And other people had noticed these kinds of similarities that Rasmus Rask, for instance, was already talking about with this P to F correspondence, but for some reason, like, Grimm gets credit for it. Okay, he was good, but, you know, there's a little bit of an eclipsing stance going on here. Anyway, for whatever reason, these sets of laws bear his name. This is Grimm's law, and it's essentially what Rasmus Rask noticed earlier. Right. The way you read this here is that, so probably I should have said this, these ones on the left here are in Proto-Indo-European. These are Proto-Indo-European letters or sounds. These ones on the right are in Germanic. They're in Germanic. And so PTK in Proto-Indo-European became F, F, Th, Ch in Germanic. P became F, just like we noticed again with Rasmus Rask. T went to Th, and K went to Ch. Summon now. Call upon phonology. Somewhere in your brain right now is hiding away in a pre-quarantined realm your knowledge of phonology, and we're going to need to summon it back in. Summon it back in right now. And I need you to look at these sets and tell me what's going on. Let's look at this one. This is probably the easiest. This is saying b-d-g, again in Proto-Indo-European, became PTK, PTK, in Germanic. What happened here? Can we describe this more simply with a single rule? These voiced stops became voiceless. These aspirated voiced stops became unaspirated voiced stops. And these voiceless stops became fricatives. Voiceless fricatives, right? That's Grimm's law. Now, why I just harped against and said that, you know, we weren't using these arrows. We're using colons. Well, this is a different situation. In this situation, I know I'm small now still, but in this situation, we were looking at two kind of modern languages. One wasn't descended from the other, right? Greek and Latin aren't descended from English and not vice versa. That's when you put a colon in there. This is a correspondence set. Up here in this example, we have Proto-Indo-European. This is actually the ancestor. Proto-Indo-European in some ways did become Germanic. It became a lot of things, one of which was Germanic. So this is actually kind of a temporal thing, right? over time, p to k went to f, th, h. Where this isn't. These are correspondence between two synchronic languages. This is transformation, essentially, from an ancestor to a child, from a parent to a child language. So that's when the arrow gets used. And that's also why I didn't want us to use the arrow here, because there's no difference, there's no time gap there. Again, I know there is between ancient Greek and Latin in these things, but not on the order that we're talking about here. Sweet. Cool. So how can we tell these things? Well, we look and we find evidence, right? This is the data that I gave you at the very beginning of class. And we see that, again, so this is the data that we looked at the beginning in class with Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and English. And here I have listed on the left Grimm's laws. Grimm's laws. P, f, t, th, k, ch. And we find evidence of this. P to f, t to th, k to h, right? D to t. To put it kind of bluntly here, what this slide is trying to tell you is that, like, look, this stuff isn't made up. There's actually good evidence. There's good scientific evidence for why we believe this stuff. Are we talking about a language that we've never heard before, that was spoken 6,000 years ago and who knows where? Yeah. So do we know exactly what that language sounded like? No, we weren't there. But we're pretty confident. We have good reason to believe. We have good evidence. We have good evidence for why we believe this stuff. And the evidence is in the data like this. A cool part about Grimm's law is that it's basically exceptionless. It happens everywhere, right? So it's not just like, well, some P's that you get become F's sometime. It's like, no, if there's a P in Proto-Indo-European, it just becomes an F in English. Always. So pretty exceptionless, which is cool. And this is it's not, disclaimer, it's not entirely exceptionless. There are exceptions like Grassmann's law, for instance, that we're not going to talk about too much in this class, but they're pretty explainable. There's reasons for even these exceptions. And this is how it is with most sound changes. Most sound changes are exceptionless. They happen across the board. It's not just a sometimes random when you feel like it. Well, it's always, unless you have a pretty good reason not to. And this is called the neo-grammarian hypothesis. Right? It's a school of linguistics, and what they came up with was this idea that sound languages are exceptionless. So sweet. We know Grimm's law. Yahoo. There it is. There it is. There it is. But we need to talk about something. Class, dearest class. We need to talk about how we got to these things. I told you that these were the sounds of Proto-Indo-European. But I kind of just told you that that's the way it was. We're going to need to do a little bit better than that. Right? These are Proto-Indo-European sounds here, but we need to figure out how we actually come up with these things in the first place, such to know that they changed into this in Germanic. Right? How do we find out what Proto-Indo-European used to sound like? That's going to be our goal for next class. Today we've done a lot of setup with historical sound change. We've looked at sound change over time and the fact that it always is changing, and still changing in largely the same ways. We looked at some laws like Grimm's law and the neo-grammarian hypothesis, that sound changes are exceptionless, and saw some examples. Next time what we're going to do is we're going to figure out how we know what we know about Proto-Indo-European. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the comparative method to figure that out. It's a way to reconstruct proto-languages. It's really cool. It's really fun. It's a powerful tool that we get to use. We'll also hopefully we'll get to it next time. If not, we will be going through some practice problems so that you can figure out what the problem sets are actually going to look like for historical linguistics. But that being said, don't worry about that at all for right now, because that won't be on your test on Monday. Instead, focus on semantics and pragmatics and syntax and review those over the next couple days while we build up for our test on Monday. We will return to this. We're going to have to give it a little break because we have a review session next and then a test. But on Wednesday of next week, we're going to come back and talk more about historical linguistics. Sweet. All right, it was a long one again today, but we're trying to get through some material. So that's probably just going to be the way it is for a little bit. If I can make shorter videos, I will. But I want to make sure that you're getting all the information that you should be out of this class, as though it were as close to in-person as possible. So I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you enjoyed historical linguistics. If I haven't convinced you that it's cool yet, give me another session at least, and I'll try and convince you. All right, I'll catch you guys next time. I'll see you Friday for your review session, if not tomorrow for my office hours.